So, hello and welcome to another episode of Warrior Diplomacy, your favorite international relations podcast. This is your host, Aramis Sinke, coming to you from Brussels in Belgium. Today we will talk about arguably one of the most important issues in the realm of international politics, at least in my humble opinion. We will address the so-called practice of information warfare, or as we will call it today, information operation. If implemented successfully, such operations can cause civil unrest, lead to the resignation of national elites, incite civil war, or worse. You may be familiar with one application of such operation or another. They are commonly known as dis- or misinformation campaigns, the Russian involvement in the 2016 US presidential elections, and the Brexit votes are prominent examples. In today's episode, we seek to explore how this issue has evolved ever since. Who are the most powerful information operation actors in international relations, and what measures are implemented to counter their actions? To delve deeper into this highly interesting topic, I'm joined today by one of the leading experts in this field, Mr. Carl Miller. Carl, thank you for being on the show. From where are you joining us today?
Aramis, everyone, hello. Yes, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I'm joining you all from the wintry, increasingly autumnal skyscapes of London.
Great. Now, before we will get into the first section of this show, I would like to briefly reflect on Carl's bio. Carl is an experienced digital researcher, author, and international speaker, interested in how technology is changing society and politics. In 2012, he co-founded the first UK think tank institute dedicated to studying the digital world at Demos, and has been its research director ever since. He writes widely on tech and society, including for The Economist, Wired, and The Telegraph, as well as The Guardian. In 2018, he released his award-winning book, The Death of Gods, which is, by the way, linked in the show notes. The Death of Gods, The New Global Power Grab, that's the full title, published by William Heinemann, and now frequently talks to audiences around the world about what changes in politics, society, media, crime, and warfare means to them. Now, in the first block of this podcast, we will learn more about the most powerful information operation actors and how they are changing the world today. Then we will look at the other side and explore what is done to curtail their actions. So, Carl, first of all, can you briefly define how information operations manifest themselves in international relations?
Well, they're actually probably one of the most defining characteristics of them is how unbelievably difficult they've been to actually define. And they have this whole kind of molten, overlapping series of definitions and ideas and words used to describe them. But it's still actually, to be honest, a very confused thicket of different definitions, Aramis. So you mentioned some of them already. So fake news was probably one of the earliest definitions. And these were kind of these commercially motivated kind of online news pieces that were literally trying to ape fake news to get clicks. Some of that was coming out of the Balkans, and that was kind of first at least seen widely during the 2016 presidential elections. And then it kind of evolved into disinformation and misinformation, then influence operations. The platforms of another definition, kind of coordinated inauthentic behaviour. Sometimes we say platform manipulation as well. Sometimes we might say violative content. The one I've liked the best, though, I think is the one that you've used the most, and that is information operations or information warfare. And the reason for that is that I think it reflects best what unites a really kind of muddled series of different behaviours and activities. And it's really a mindset. And the mindset is that information joins air, sea, land and space as a theatre of war. Not a tool of war, I think a space that war happens within. And that means that the way it manifests is that people will try and manoeuvre in that space. They will try and seize attention like a form of territory. They'll try and change basically what we encounter, the information that surround us, for exactly the same reasons as you do any manoeuvre in air, sea, land or space as well, which is ultimately behavioural and attitudinal effects. That's why warfare's fought. That's why force is used when it is. And that's also why information warfare is waged. It's to have behavioural and attitudinal effects. And these campaigns or these operations, these individual examples are done with that in mind, ultimately.
So now that we are aware that there is a space of warfare, when we think of the actors acting within this space, who do you think are the most powerful information operations actors in the world, especially if we look at it from an international relations perspective? Russia is a buzzword frequently used here. Would you say that it is a fair assessment that Russia is the most powerful information operations actor in the world?
Well, as a researcher, one of my jobs is to come and tell you just how little we really know about these kind of phenomena, and that's a really important thing for us to begin on. So, certainly digital researchers, people like me, we spend a lot of our lives looking at online behaviour. That might be individual examples of accounts doing stuff, individual messages. Maybe it's large patterns, that we've tried to draw out of, stunningly massive data sets. It can be either. But the one thing that we very, very seldom actually learn is who is genuinely lurking behind activity that we think is suspicious. That's called attribution. And attribution is something actually that if you're not a state and you're not a platform, you should very, very rarely do, and you should do only very tentatively. So we see operations all the time. It's kind of quite hard sometimes to miss them. There's so many different examples that have been written about by me, other think tankers, by other researchers, by the platforms themselves, by tons of journalists. But who is behind that? We often don't know. And I think it's now I'm moving away from like what the data tells us necessarily to a bit more about just what I think. I think it's a tangle of lots of different kinds of actor. The barriers to entry, obviously, to do information warfare are very low, much lower than doing a kind of physical, kinetic form of war. And that means that actually the actors that do it can be much broader. So you mentioned states. Definitely states. Like states have been looking at information warfare, redrawing their operational doctrines for decades now. They were some of the first kinds of actors to become interested in this. Russia's a buzzword, but this is much probably more widely waged than simply Russia. You can look at the Philippines or Malaysia or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. I think every major political party in India during the last election had inauthentic networks removed by Facebook and named at the time. So this is being done all over the world, both for, and I know we're going to talk about this, geopolitical advantage, but often for domestic repression as well and control. But then joining states, the other main actors I would say are probably political campaigns, so consultants or groups that are basically trying to win political power, extremist political mobilizations as well, sometimes simply disaffected individuals, do information warfare or platform manipulation. And then we've also seen the growth, this is a pretty new trend over the last couple of years, of like for-profit groups. So people doing this, basically selling one kind of service or another to anyone that's willing to pay for it online. So lots of different actors. I think we often assume it's, and obviously they'll all bounce off each other. So we might see states paying for services from private actors. But probably the most important message there is very important not to assume we know who is behind this.
If we now focus on the role of states and if we consider the role of impact, do you think that, or would you argue that would you assess that there's a possible way to say this state can potentially unleash the most impact?
Yes. I think tentatively you can look at the kinds of capabilities that state might have created. So these traditions and capabilities don't come out of nowhere. In many ways, what we're really looking at is our states kind of making sense of much longer traditions, capabilities and tradecrafts in the digital age. So for Russia, you look back at reflective control, you look back at the Cold War, and for many states, you can trace what happens today all the way back to, say, political and psychological warfare fought during the Second World War, and even earlier back to kind of theories of total war from the First, and sometimes even further back than that. States have been thinking about populational control on the home front for centuries now. I think what is very difficult, though, is you can look at even, say, budgets, and you might be able to look at, say, military formations or some technologies, and often, obviously, there's information that's sometimes leaked, sometimes spoken about. What's hard is to see how the rubber hits the road, though, and what that really means in terms of capability in the digital world. And there, I think, much like the analogous capability, cyber offensive operations, cyber warfare, it's very hard for us to kind of judge and rank states. I mean, generally speaking, of course, we know the states that spend a lot on geopolitical capability, and we know the states that have the money to spend it. And you would imagine there would be some kind of correlation between spending and capability. I would say, though, one final interesting and useful distinction is probably around the nature of the polity, so liberal democratic states versus autocratic. I think, the limiting factors to information warfare are not always technical ones, they're also legal and reputational ones. And of course, in Brussels, in the UK, and across Europe, we've got quite strong safeguards to try and control what liberal democratic militaries can properly do in terms of interfering in media and information systems, very rightly. And I often think permission to operate there is what holds those militaries back.
Yeah, and I think it's a highly interesting discussion with the West and its role in the whole information operations circus, because we often tend to look at this from a victim-perpetrator perspective. We say here in the West, okay, there's Russia, there's China, and other malign actors attacking our information spaces. And you have just mentioned that the West, on the other hand, does not have the same abilities, the same tools due to the institutional setting. But what I think is interesting is also the Russian perspective, for example, in this, because they would claim that this is absolutely not true. And they would argue that the West does have a lot of power in this information space. What they would argue is that, for example, the West has these large international broadcasting networks. I just looked up a number here in the fiscal year 2023. The agency heading US broadcasting efforts globally had a budget of $1 billion, financing popular channels like Voice of America, Radio Liberty. And then there's other popular channels in the West, like Germany's Deutsche Welle or the BBC's World Service. So what I would be interested in, do you think that it's really such a major distinction that you have the West that is not capable and not institutionally able to influence? Or is this actually a contested issue where you have the great powers who have a lot of tools to influence, for example, the global South and each other?
Well, I mean, look, firstly, there of course is information warfare capabilities built by Western states, and no kind of no dispassionate or neutral analysis could say the opposite. I mean, and we've seen liberal democratic states do information operations in the past. But I do think there is an important distinction between the kind of relationship between media and a state when that state is either a liberal democracy or an autocracy. And so the relationship between Deutsche Welle and the German government or the BBC and the British government is entirely different from the relationship between RT and the Russian government. And sometimes that distinction is quite hard to really kind of get across to people unless you've been in one of those institutions, because what you'd really love to show them is, the raucous editorial meeting in the BBC to discuss what should really be leading the news that day. All the internal investigations into, possible corruptions within the British government, or possible, kind of injustices conducted by the British Army. That is very different as an institutional relationship than what you will see with RT and the Russian state. Like RT, and I know this because this is the kind of thing I research, their vessels, their channels, and their outputs kind of very closely echo the geopolitical talking points of the Russian state. There is no genuine internal investigation. There is no criticism of the Russian state in any kind of meaningful way, and there's no real departure from kind of Kremlin talking points. And that means that and there is a relentless interest with trying to expose Western decadence, Western hypocrisy, and the hollowness of Western values. We fund kind of media organs in the West, but I think that is to show and to kind of represent how important a genuine, free and powerful press is to protect the kind of societies we want to live in. And that is been aped and in a way been mimicked by autocracies, and it's easy to make something that looks like the free press, with a ticker tape running down the back and people that masquerade as journalists. But you're not a journalist if you're being given your editorial talking points from a military, and then you repeat them. So this is a kind of important moment, I think, because I think in many ways, like, as information warfare has emerged, we're all trying to work out. It's like many things actually. I wrote about in Death of the Gods, that book you mentioned at the beginning, where all these new areas have emerged, and it's actually really unclear what the rules are now. So information warfare has emerged, and I don't think we have really a kind of set, kind of well codified kind of series of rules of war. And so all states are trying to work that out differently. I don't think we know in the West what a kind of legitimate use of information warfare would be. But I think it's very different from an autocratic government. And I think kind of drawing false equivalences is easy to do, and it's rhetorically done all the time. But when you really dig deeper, I think you find very, very different realities.
In many Western states, we see also the tendency to draw down on these investments. For example, I think the Republican Party, for example, under Donald Trump, they for sure had their initiatives to limit the budget of the US broadcasting services. If you were an advisor of a Western government, would you tell them that these broadcasting services are perhaps the best tool they have at hand to counter such threats from autocratic states?
Well, I would certainly try and convince governments to. I mean, you're completely right, by the way. And at the same time as we've seen, information warfare erupt across, and real warfare erupt across Ukraine and Europe, we also have been reducing UK government support for the BBC World Service, which I think is a massive shame. And yes, I absolutely would try and convince kind of the UK government to try and reverse that, because it's not like the UK. I mean, if you ever listen to the UK World Service, it's not a kind of unending series of vanity stories about the UK or its government, but it's an extremely important source of independent journalism in many different languages for people living around the world in information environments that are much more contested than they are in the West, and where often there are lots of other, where free press actually doesn't necessarily flourish. So I think it's really important, and it's always been the BBC World Service, for instance. It was a massively important source of news and analysis and learning about the world for people. And I think it's a huge shame when we cut back on that sort of thing. I don't think it alone is a kind of either a kind of solution to or a prevention of information warfare. Hopefully we can dig into why, but I think it's in and of itself an important thing and a very good thing, and an important contribution that liberal democracies make.
And let's straight dig into it. Why isn't it a good solution to information warfare?
I think that the main reason why is that information warfare influence operations doesn't equal lies or disinformation. I think they're very often overlapped with each other. So we very often think that the way in which all of this works is that, you know, you've got some evil person out there that kind of spreads a lie that people believe and then change their mind about the world. But that's not really, I mean, there are a million ways to influence people. And there are all these other kind of opportunities for an influence operation to work, which have nothing to do with explicitly lying. Like simply making one fact more visible than another fact is a great way of influencing you. As is telling you things you already think are true about the world and then making you anger about them and guiding that anger in a certain direction, recontextualizing the grievances that you have, speaking to your sense of identity and belonging. You know, these are all huge motivators to action. In fact, actually much more powerful really than a kind of rationalist, evidence-based argument often. And the people that conduct sophisticated influence operations know this. They know that there's no need. I mean, I haven't interviewed many people that have done influence operations in my life, but the people that I have, you know, they always say, you know, Carl, you know, we don't try and lie about the world to get you to change their mind. We tell you stuff that you think is true. So I often think that the kind of problem then is like quite importantly and dangerously misconceived. So we conceive of this as a problem of truth and lies, and it's not. It's a problem of hidden influence. And that means that simply, you know, and most of our responses have been about either introducing more truths, trying to make truths more visible, or trying to kind of provide better information to allow people to navigate around the lies. Digital literacy, fact-checking, except, you know, good journalism, all important, but not fixes to information operations or influence, illicit influence. And I think we often feel like we're protected somehow when we're not being lied to. And in fact, actually, it's when we're being told things we think are true, that's when we're most vulnerable.
So what is then the perfect solution? Or I know perfect is a little exaggerated, but what could be a potential solution here? What I would think personally is the education sector. When I learned at the university about conspiracy theories, I learned that if a person is confronted with a conspiracy theory without any prior knowledge to it, there is a high probability that this person will believe at least an aspect of the conspiracy theory. But if a person is priorly informed about this phenomenon, about the potential effects, then the conspiracy theory is not as successful. There's a dramatic increase in the potential success of the conspiracy theory. So what I would assume is that if we invested in the education sector and people learned about the overall phenomenon, then we could do a lot to curtail these operations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tempting supposition, and it's probably not true. So, I mean, I spent a year hanging out with the 9/11 Truth Movement. I mean, the first pamphlet I ever wrote for Demos was on conspiracy theories that the conspiracy theorists didn't like very much at all. So I spent a long time engaging with them, trying to argue with them at times, and I think I learned two things. Firstly, at least the conspiracy theorists that I met and got to know were better educated than normal people. Many of them were university academics or students, certainly very interested in the world around them and in learning about it. I never really saw conspiracy theoretical belief to be a function of ignorance. Secondly, I don't think I convinced a single one of them, even though I spent a year trying to give them more information, better information, send them links. I learned that it was as much to do with friendship and empowerment. I mean, it's very empowering and very fun, I think, to be a conspiracy theorist for them. You know, they spent their weekends going to conventions and, you know, working to wake us up, the benighted sheeple, from our kind of, you know, silly slumber. You know, it gives a lot of meaning to be in a position where you can see this kind of shadowy government plot to control the world, and you're only one of a very small number of people that can see that. I think that gives you a really strong motivator to get out there and do something. So I think in many ways, actually, hidden influence, well, firstly, hidden influence operations exploit, use, and connect with conspiracy theorists a lot. There's definitely an important overlap between the two. But I do think that there is a lot in what we understand about conspiracy theory belief that actually tells us just generally how we're influenced. That this is this is much more to do with how we feel than how we think. And the response probably isn't in either of these problems to just introduce better information. I think there's kind of two kind of responses that I think, or bodies of responses I think that are probably worthwhile to think about. On the individual basis, I think there are things we can all do. So we need to slow ourselves down online because influence operations exploit our speed. We need to avoid the way that platforms serve us up information. We need to avoid virality and virals. All of that can be gamed. We need to lean away from metrics, number of retweets or number of likes and so on, as being kind of proxies for authority. Probably most importantly, we need to calm down our own sense of outrage, because it's probably outrage and moral indignation that get triggered the most by influence operators. And ultimately, treat our information diet like a diet. I mean, it has health consequences for us. It's very important that we don't consume garbage online, and we don't just wait for the information to find us. We proactively go out and find the information that we want to find about the world ourselves, rather than just passively scrolling into new information. But then also there are more collective responses, aren't there, that we need to think about as well. If I was a government, or maybe a civic societal operator, or maybe someone running a startup, I would think about responses, especially in a liberal democracy. We are going to lose if we fight information warfare with more information warfare. Like, we as liberal democracies lose out doing that. We don't want to militarize information spaces because we gain the most from them. Instead, we need to find asymmetric responses to really target the worst people doing this. There are reasonably small number, I would say, of professional, sophisticated actors that probably conduct the most harmful information operations around the world. Really the ones that successfully start mucking around in elections or targeting minority groups, whipping up anti-migrant hatred, that sort of thing. Their lives need to become less comfortable. We need to sanction them. They need to be on no-fly lists, and we need to start looking at criminal and consumer rights legislation to go after them and the interests that they have, and even in some cases, I think, look at kind of national security legislation, especially when these people work on behalf of autocratic intelligence agencies.
That's a great way to bridge to the next section, where we'll talk about the responses from regulators, from the platforms themselves, after the sound. In this second segment, we explore what is done to combat information operations. First of all, let's explore the role of the social media companies. Many people remember that back in the days, Meta CEO Zuckerberg pledged to US Congress that the freedom of speech must be protected, rejecting any anti-disinformation initiatives. Later on, Meta took a different turn. It removed Donald Trump from the platform, and a couple of months ago, he was allowed to come back to Facebook and other social media giants. Now, considering the approach of these companies today, what do you think is their approach to information operations? And are they successful in combating such actions, at least to a limited extent?
I know there are very good people working in lots of these platforms that do their very best to identify and clear information operations off the platform. I think there's been a number of cases now where we've seen, sadly, like reductions in that staff. And really, the way I've often seen this dynamic is that there's always a kind of big, sometimes a war, sometimes a tension within the giants. On the one hand, you've got kind of, safety and integrity and legal and policy folks who do actually want to implement changes to make these platforms safer. That might be clearing stuff off, like enforcement action. It might be changing the way the platforms work. introducing friction, for instance. But then you've also, on the other hand, you've got like revenue and growth and people that basically see those interventions as costing money and ultimately reducing the size of the platforms, which is not what they want. If you want the platforms to grow, you try and get rid of friction, you don't add it. And there's been this kind of conflict of incentives like rippling in all of them. And I think, sadly, what we see is that profit-seeking private commercial entities with fiduciary duties to shareholders are not the right kind of vehicle to manage those conflicting incentives. So often the activity, I think, will be driven by, say, reputational concern. So like things like political exposure or media exposure. And as we've seen, when big economic conditions seem to swing against, well, all of us, but including the platforms, they'll then start reducing staff, as has happened in a number of platforms now. And that's why, really, thank God, ultimately, we are moving away from a world where we will necessarily need to simply beg and prevail on the platforms to make these kinds of decisions for us. In Europe, you know, you've got the Electronic Markets Act, Digital Services Act have just come in. We've just had the Online Safety Bill turn into an Online Safety Act here in the UK, so we have a new law too. It's going to be a while for all of this to shake out, and I don't really know, if I'm honest with you, exactly where influence operations and information warfare sit in the kind of landscape of harm as that will emerge and be, you know, and be supervised and be looked at by regulators. But I certainly think that things like electoral interference, you know, or hate speech towards minority groups, or, you know, deliberate amplification of toxic wedge issues within a given nation state. These have to be areas that regulators are now going to look at, and you know, and they now have statutory powers to cause the platforms to take various forms of enforcement action, you know, that they think is sufficient, not the platform think is sufficient. And that's going to be difficult. Like it's hard. These are hard determinations to make. How much is enough? How much should the platforms spend? You know, how do we reconcile the desire to protect online spaces with the desire to protect freedom of speech? These are all difficult accommodations, but they're now ones that democratic authorities increasingly are going to be doing rather than private American companies.
Before we get into the regulations itself, I would like to ask, can you draw a comparison between the platforms? Like, are there platforms where you think, okay, these are actually really good at curbing down information operations and others are worse? Not thinking about like the fringe platforms that exist, for example, for the extreme right, but looking really at the biggest, like Reddit, Twitter, X, however you want to call it, Instagram, Meta, whatsoever.
Well, my favourite approach is actually Wikipedia, because it's completely different from the other platforms, and you know, unlike the others, has an entirely voluntary team of editors and administrators who run like really capable and such impressive kind of enforcement operations themselves. Layers of AI, sock puppet investigations, a whole kind of user powers regime. But ultimately, the reason I think it's so impressive is that it's held. You know, I mean, Wikipedia is also a big target, even if we don't discuss it as often as we will Meta or YouTube. But it's being defended and held together by people who do it out of the sheer love of what Wikipedia has managed to achieve, not because they're receiving a paycheck. And that, to me, you know, in the face of, I can say, you know, sometimes very, very scary levels of abuse and threat being directed at the administrators and editors who do that enforcement activity on Wikipedia, many of whom have to stay anonymous when they talk about these kind of things publicly because they're worried about the threats that can be angled against them. And I think that alone is an inspirational story. And anyone listening to this, you know, they might be interested in influence operations. You don't have to wait until you're hired by Meta to get involved in the struggle to confront this. Become a editor on Wikipedia. learn from the editors there about how they try and seek these things out, help them build tools to find it, and get going. Anyone can do that.
And if we go beyond Wikipedia and look at the major traditional social media platforms, can you draw a comparison between YouTube and Twitter and Meta?
No, because these platforms are insufficiently transparent to allow us to make any kind of proper empirical comparison. So platform data availabilities mean that it's impossible really for us to draw any kind of representative data set from any of these platforms. Therefore, we can't make any kind of platform-wide propositions around how much is either on there or how much is being taken down. It's a comparison I would love to make, because I think that's of profound public interest and something which is very important as we move into a regulatory regime as well. But I can't as a researcher really stand up here and just give you a kind of top of the mind kind of ranking. I don't think that's my job, and I don't think I can do it based on firm data.
But that's maybe a good way to get to the regulation aspect of things, because one of the provisions of the Digital Services Act by the European Union is that transparency among those big social media platforms is increased. So when we look at this first aspect from the regulation perspective, do you think that this will help you as a researcher to find out more about information operations and to curtail them one day?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, provisions around researcher data access, to me, are absolutely the crux of so much of this. They're more important than really anything else. If we can't have data, then we don't know where the problem is, how big it is, who it's targeting, what its impacts might have. We don't know anything. And yes, you're right. There are powers now, both obviously for regulators to require platforms to hand data over to the regulators, which is great, and then also to create APIs for researchers. How that pans out, though, is anyone's guess. I mean, I don't know. We haven't seen these new data provisions actually practically come into force yet. So I don't have any more data than I did a year ago. In fact, I have quite a lot less. So we'll see. We'll see what these APIs are like. We'll see how much data they provide. We'll see what conditions and licensing agreements will be around the data. I think there's some concerns there that the platforms will create a kind of series of legal barriers towards the data being used in ways which are effective to platform accountability. Assuming we can navigate around all of that, yes, it will be very, very useful and extremely important for those provisions to be that those provisions were made and that they are now hopefully going to be affected.
And if we take a more wholesome approach towards these legislative initiatives, concretely the EU's Digital Service Act and the UK's Online Safety Bill, right? Bill? Act. Now it's an act,
now it's
right?
An
act. What's your opinion on these initiatives? What do they fall short of? What's perhaps something that's great about them?
No, well, I mean, I think probably people that have listened to my answers up to now will know what I think about this. I mean, they have their critics and they have their problems, but I mean, the big picture is that they're unbelievably important pieces of legislation. I mean, I've been calling for this kind of law for 10 years. It's taken 10 years really to go from a world where we were asking the platforms to please just do a bit more through to one now where there are legally enshrined responsibilities that they have and enforcement powers for when they fall short, and that's very important. And it's a new age we've stepped into now, and one where I think we'll continue to try and improve those laws. We'll try and I mean, there's lots and lots of open questions still. What the online harms really are, how they should be defined. What the requisite enforcement actions are, and so on, and not least, we've got very big platforms, niche platforms. Are they going to comply? Are they not? Loads. But this is now, we now have a a kind of a tree trunk that we can add branches and take branches away from. You know, we have that kind of core basis in law, where we have agreed that there are responsibilities that didn't exist before that law came in, and I think that's massively important. It came 2 years too late, from my opinion, and I think a huge amount of social discord, polarization, ethnic violence around the world has been probably caused as a result of these platforms not being put into a proper regulatory context until now. But I'm very glad that it's in place from this point on.
And as a final aspect of potential initiatives to curb down information operations, I would like to address the work that you have been involved in. You are co-producing tools which can detect information operations by processing data and identifying certain patterns. How crucial is this strain of research in the fight against information operations?
Well, I mean, I would say it's pretty crucial. Yeah, importantly, you know, I'm part of a team of developers and technologists that have largely, as a team, we've been working on this together for 10 years, that are dedicated to building, basically to try and use emerging analytic capabilities, especially around natural language processing and AI and machine learning, to try and detect these things for civic societal researchers. So we've kind of long believed that civic society is a really important part of this puzzle, because it's civic society that can often advocate for laws to be changed and can advocate for action to be taken and can work with the media to expose this and work with the platforms to stop it. You know, the kind of almost the glue between all of these different other actors in society. But they really need kind of the technology to make all this happen. You know, and that technology can be really expensive. A lot of it wasn't aligned to these kinds of needs. Like, it was drawn from marketing and advertising. It's constantly changing, of course, because the opportunities change as all of these underlying technologies get better. So that's where we've tried to sit, really, constantly trying to develop new ways of doing it. Obviously, the problem that information operations itself constantly changes, and so the ways in which it can be spotted change too. So we've kind of tried to sit in the middle of all of this, trying to keep up with it as best we can, new data sources, new analytic capabilities, new tradecraft and methods of the bad actors, and then try and make those tools available to the civic societal members that are trying to ultimately go out there and try and spot it all.
Our final segment takes a forward-looking approach, probing into the future of information operations. Carl, what is your overall evaluation? Will it get better or worse? Who will gain the upper hand when it comes to information operations, actors, their regulators, and then researchers like you trying to curve down on them?
Well, the trade crafts will inevitably become more sophisticated, for sure. I mean, so people doing information operations will have new ideas. They will use more powerful technology. They will build better processes to do it. They will better integrate the technical with the psychological, with the social. You know, it's a human technology ultimately, and it will, it will develop. But I'm actually kind of a bit of an outlier perhaps here, in that I'm actually quite optimistic about the future, because this has become, in 5 years maybe, it's transformed from a kind of geeky think tanker kind of niche research discipline to be now one of the most visible major international issues that we're grappling with. There are summits on this, there are working groups, there's new ideas, there's thousands of students that pour in with all these great new things that they want to do and solutions that might work. There's a ton of talent and energy that's being thrown at this problem. In many ways, it kind of reminds me like the years after 9/11 and counterterrorism, where that field became completely transformed. That was the context, indeed, that I kind of started my professional life in working in counterterrorism. And I feel like counter-influence operations is the equivalent of that now. maybe we'll see a kind of similar process. Like the problem won't go away, but it'll become better managed. We'll create kind of more resilient information spaces and societies gradually over time. We'll develop a more formidable toolkit to pursue the bad actors and to levy costs and risks against them. And maybe, in some cases, we'll also be able to find ways of kind of getting at the root problem and almost like kind of stopping the drivers of it. So how do we kind of declare peace in information systems, and kind of demilitarize information spaces? Maybe we'll even get there. I don't know. But I do think that it is, like any societal threat, really, it's important not to see it as this kind of, kind of overwhelming boogeyman. It's not. It's just a new risk, or it's an old risk that's taken on, some new clothes. And we're just in these early years now of working out how to respond to it properly, and how to blunt its effects on us all. And of course, there are many brilliant podcasts like the one you're doing now that can kind of connect listeners up with it and spread awareness of it, and that is also really, really different to what it was like 5 years ago, where no one even had heard of this sort of thing and thought it was kind of a kind of mad, shadowy world that they'd never encountered before. Nowadays, I think most people probably have heard something about disinformation campaigns probably, and that they're out there, and what they might be trying to do.
I'm glad you're having such an optimistic perspective on this. When I look at the political landscape these days, I think that we are certainly at crossroads, and it's crucial that we step up our game in this regard. But it's as we've discussed, a very complex issue. But in the end, I'm very happy that we can leave our listeners with this optimistic approach to this topic. Thank you, Carl. Thank you for joining our show today. It was a pleasure to listen to you. I learned a lot as usual. And if you are interested in learning more about the dynamics in the digital age, check out Carl's book that I've mentioned before, The Death of Gods, The New Global Power Grab. The link is provided in the show notes, and what is also provided in the show notes are the socials of Carl, so you can follow him on LinkedIn, on X, Twitter, and stay updated in this very important issue.